Good evening, everyone. It is after 6 o'clock on Wednesday evening, so we are going to begin our next to the last session on organic outreach. If you have been here for all the sessions, that's great. If you've only been here for one or two, that is no problem. We have been talking about what it looks like for people. I'm just going to move this a little bit out of my way. Here we go. What does it look like for us to share the gospel, not just in a evangelistic way, but in a loving, life transforming, redemptive way that does lead to people coming into a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. So we are going to jump in here tonight. Again, I'll be throwing some things up on the slides that you should be able to sort of see while I am also talking. So we're in session 7. This is chapter 11. Our plan is, and we'll discuss this again kind of towards the end, but our plan is to do chapter 11 tonight. Next week, we're going to kind of combine chapters 12 and 13 because they really get into some stuff that we're going to focus on more as a church, as a whole church later down the road. So we're just going to touch on it very briefly with next week, and then we'll be done with the book and with the book study. So feel free to share these videos. They are on our Facebook page, so they're public to share or to invite people to participate in. We're also hoping to download all of them and then put them into a YouTube playlist so that people can go back and kind of work their way through the book at their own speed if they want to. And it's just a matter of time before we can get that done, but it shouldn't be too complicated, okay? We are watching the live stream feed through Facebook, so if you have any prayer requests, you can throw those on there. There will also be some questions and comments that you could be giving as you are participating through Facebook. Ruben and Darcy are here in the room with me, so as they are talking or interacting, you should be able to pick up their volume here on the feed. I just want to make sure. Yes, okay, I just had to check my screen for a second, make sure everything was up and running. Okay, so let's begin by talking about the value of conversations. So the word that I want to, or the question, sorry about that. The question that I really want to begin with is, why are conversations so valuable? What is it about conversations that is helpful? Not even just about religious things. I mean, just in general. Why do people enjoy having conversations with other people? What does it allow them to do? And I'm going to throw that question kind of out there in general. If you have comments and want to drop them in to the comment section on the Facebook feed, go ahead and do that. What is it about conversation that is so appreciated, so adaptable, so interesting to people? And I'll start off by saying one thing that comes to my mind, that conversation is appealing to a lot of people because there is nothing formal about it. There's nothing scripted about it. Conversation literally can start with, how are you doing today? You know, I'm fine. How are you? I've had a busy day. You know, it can be about the weather. It can be about your kids. It can be about the neighborhood. It can be about work. It can be any number of things. It doesn't have to be scripted. And that's an important thing for us to keep in mind as we actually work through this chapter. But you don't have to have any special skill set. Now, there are a lot of people who are very shy that would say, oh, it takes a very special skill set to be able to carry on a conversation. But I found even the shyest people are usually good at carrying on conversations. It's just the right setting in which they're able to carry on conversation. They may not want to be in a conversation of 4 or 5 people. Maybe it needs to be somebody that they've gotten to know very well, but it's still a valuable way of communicating information because it doesn't have to be about any one specific thing. It's not a lecture. It's not a monologue. It's just a discussion of ideas. So that's one thing that I would kind of throw out there for myself anyway, that I think is helpful about conversation. You guys, anything, when you think about talking with people, why do we like talking with people? Okay. Yeah.
What they have in common.
Yeah.
When I walk in Walmart, I see somebody with a Navy hat,
Sure.
or a Marine hat, I usually go up and talk to them, or else if they got a funny t-shirt.
Right. Yeah, and again, that's the beauty of conversation is you can start it at almost any point, right? Again, it doesn't have to be, oh, I've got to make sure that this person, and I, really are going to hit it off or have a good conversation. It really can be something like, hey, I noticed this about what you're wearing or about something you said or whatever, and it struck me, or and then you start to find that familiarity, like, oh, we have this in common, or we've had this experience, and again, we're not talking even about religious conversations. I'm just talking about conversation in general. We find out more about other people by conversing with them. In marriage counseling, we talk about the value of communication, right? And that even if one person's more talkative than the other, there's still value in them learning to talk to each other, especially as their primary source of communication. That if one person is using all of their communicative efforts with at work or in other places, and they have nothing left to communicate with their spouse, then that kind of leaves a void. And that happens a lot, but we have to kind of work through that. But it's a way of just discussing. It brings value to the other person, I think. Hey, I want to hear about you. I want to hear about your day. I want to hear about your experience. Wow, we have this in common, or here's what's happened to me. So, okay, good input. I'm going to then move the conversation a little bit to this question. What is an organic conversation? Because this particular chapter of our book is talked about engaging in spiritual conversations, but the name of the book is Organic Outreach. So I've kind of combined those two things, and I'm putting this question out there, and I'm actually going to throw this one into the Facebook feed. I actually had it typed up ahead of time so people could respond to it. When we say organic conversation, what is it that comes to mind? What does it bring to mind? What is an organic conversation? Let's start with the word organic. How do we use the word organic these days? Okay, it's natural. If we go to the grocery store and you have vegetables that are labeled, your celery, your lettuce, your spinach, whatever, and next to it you have the same looking vegetables, but they say organic, you assume that there is nothing in or on those vegetables that you wouldn't find if you just planted the seeds in the ground and let it go. Okay, it's actually not true. When things are labeled organic, there's guidelines. They have to be within a certain parameter of what you're allowed to put on them, but it certainly is more natural. Darcy used the word natural. It certainly is more of that. Okay, so the word organic means natural. How else? What else does the word organic bring to mind besides natural? Anything else? Genuine. Okay, it's not manufactured, right? It's real. It's real. So if somebody comes to you and says, I was talking to so-and-so and it just kind of came up organically that whatever, they mean it just really happened naturally. There was no priming the pump. There was no, squeezing information out of them. It just happened naturally. Okay, good. So we've started off by talking about conversation, which is people engaging in very informal dialogue. Again, it's not, I don't have a research paper that I'm going to read to you from it. It can differ at the level, conversation in a faculty lounge of professors at the university probably is a little bit different than, conversation at the ball team, out on the diamond. But it probably carries a lot of similar properties that we might actually be surprised. Why? Because conversation all has this in common. It takes place between people. And people are people. Whether they're at work, at play, whether they're with their families or in the community, people are people. So conversation always involves the human element, okay? Which is part of why it's unpredictable, right? You ever started a conversation with somebody and 30 seconds into it, you were like, this is going nowhere. Like it's one word answers, it's no answer. And you're like, man, I'm trying to talk with you, So that's conversation. Organic, we've just said genuine, natural, real, not forced, if you will. Okay. So organic conversation is the interaction of ideas between people that comes about naturally, not forced. That is organic conversation. Now, we're going to talk about what that looks like spiritually in just a minute. But let's use a different example, okay? If someone comes and knocks on your door and you answer the door and it's not somebody that you know, they say, I'd like to talk to you for a minute. Do you have a vacuum cleaner? Do you vacuum on a regular basis? Okay, you know where this is headed. And as much as door-to-door salesmen are not nearly as much of a thing as they used to be, I've had at least one at my house just in the time we've lived in Hudson, and we've been here less than a decade, and it was not immediately after we moved in. So I've had at least one, a vacuum salesman, come to the door. They were doing their job. I sort of wish they wouldn't have come after dark. That made a little bit of a difference to me, and then sort of forced their way in. That also wasn't real appealing to me. I sort of wish that they hadn't dumped an entire container of dirt on my floor to prove how great their vacuum was. That was not real appealing, and I didn't buy the product, but they were doing their job and it wasn't really a threat to me, okay? If you were indeed looking for a new vacuum cleaner, do you think that you would be more inclined to buy one from somebody who you knew was working off of a script that they had gone over and over and over and over in their head so that they could tell you exactly what you wanted to hear? Or would you be more inclined to take seriously the opinion of someone who was just your neighbor or a friend or a family member who had experience with the product, who didn't have any vested interest in you buying it, except they just want what was best for you? And it just comes up in natural conversation. Oh, I probably need to buy a new vacuum cleaner. Hey, we bought this one and we've been really happy with it. Who do we tend to believe? The person that we don't want, the person we have a relationship with, right? But two, the person who doesn't have to have a force prepared mechanism by which to sell it to us. Now, I'm not saying shame on salesmen. It's a way of transacting goods. If you go to a car lot, you sort of expect to interact with somebody who knows more about that car than you do, right? It's a salesperson. But you also know that there's a bit of scriptedness to how salespeople have to work. Let's move out of the realm of sales. You could say the same thing about philosophies or about opinions or politics. Whenever somebody's going from a written script, we always kind of get the feeling of, okay, but this is exactly what they want us to hear. Okay. And I think everybody feels like if I can just hear someone off the cuff, I'll get a better idea of who they really are. Okay. So now let's transition that into the context of spirituality. There is a significant difference between a planned, memorized script and an organic conversation. Now, I don't have any problem, and I do this, going over my mind, if the opportunity presents itself, these are things I would like to say to somebody. These are things that are in my head that I would like to say. But usually, if I have memorized the information that I want to give to somebody and it's my little spiel, it's not going to come off as genuine because it's not, right? Ruben, you talked about just starting a conversation with somebody, maybe based on something they're wearing or something you saw or noticed about them. That, even if you think in your mind ahead of time, I'm going to go talk to that person, it's not like you do anything other than just react. You see them, you walk up to them, you start talking, and it just kind of develops. Same thing if, again, you're in the neighborhood and there's, another family, or those things just happen. And we might be intentional about engaging in conversations with people at work, neighborhood, family. But if we are working from a script in our mind, we've got to get them here and then to that point and then to that point, we probably are going to come across as very phony. Because, and I found this to be true about working with the vacuum salesman that came to my door, if somebody interrupts the memorized script in order to ask a question or in order to, wait a minute, does that quite make sense? Or wait a minute, let's talk about this over here. It throws the whole conversation off, right? A memorized script needs to be delivered almost without interruption, or it feels like you haven't achieved what you set out to achieve. So organic conversation is really about allowing conversations to develop naturally. It's not always easy because sometimes we end up having to wait longer than maybe we want, but that's better than forcing it. Now, I want to, let me see if I can jump back. I'm going to try, there we go. There I am. I want to be careful here because let's pose this question. What is the danger of always just waiting for the right opportunity to have an organic conversation? What's the danger with that? Of just waiting for the right opportunity to come along. Maybe it's not a danger for anybody else. It's a danger for me. Mm-hmm. Yes.
As long as things just come in and you can relate to another person. First of all, you can relate to another person better if you listen to them first.
Right.
Show that you care about what they're saying.
Right, and again, that shows you're not just memorized here. You got to listen to me.
About what you're going to say.
Right.
If you're really listening.
Right.
You can actually, that organic conversation can happen because you can relate and you're listening and you can actually maybe say, you'll start the conversation with something you might have in common about what they're talking about.
Right.
So,
we can't forget the conversing part of conversation, which means they should be talking as much as you are. Right. And some of us, and I say us because I'm definitely in this category, we always feel that because I have no problem talking to people. I always feel like I should carry the conversation because I don't want them to feel like they have to. But that often comes across like, I don't care what they have to say, even if it's not true. So the danger with always waiting for the right opportunity is we begin to use as an excuse, because as Darcy just said, organic conversation is going to happen. So if we're always just like, oh, it wasn't the right time. Oh, well, let's just, want to get that right window in there where I can really, we're not talking about waiting for the right window to bring up Jesus. We're talking about engaging in organic conversations. If God is an important part of our life, he's going to become part of those organic conversations. And that's really what this chapter was about. We're going to talk about how he discusses that. Was it in this chapter that he told the story about the woman on the plane? Yeah, where he really of all days had no interest in talking to her. And here is an atheist woman from another country who literally spends her life trying to keep kids from being brainwashed by Christianity. And at the end of the flight, she's having an open, engaging conversation with him about her faith or lack thereof. And he said, I think one thing he said in the book was, if that woman was open to an organic conversation, then really there aren't many people who aren't, if it is approached in the right way. So that really kind of struck me. Yes. Yep. And he didn't interrupt. Well, you don't really know. And in fact, he waited until she was done to even tell her he was a pastor, which I can vouch for this. It is the worst question to get asked. It is the absolute worst question, because as soon as you say the answer, and then everything starts to fall apart. At least you feel like it is. It probably really isn't, but that's how you feel. Yeah, that's exactly, and you can sense that as a pastor, like, oh, now there go. And in fact, sometimes I have talked about a church that I go to, or a church, something that's happening at my church, or, different things like that, without ever telling people I was the pastor of the church. I just will say like, well, I go to that church or whatever. And then at some point I know, like, I have to tell them, because if they ever did come, they'd be like, what? But I don't want that to be what I don't want that to be what the conversation is built on, right? I want it to be built on that I'm just a person who happens to be a Christian, who happens to be a pastor. but it doesn't always come off that way. That's for sure. Okay, he talked, one of the things that jumped out at me in this chapter was his discussion about scaling. Do you remember him talking about the scale of where people are at in their relationship with God? That's very interesting. So we're going to talk about that here. Let me pull it up here. We're going to talk about the pros and cons. The pros and cons of scaling. Okay, the pros and cons of scaling. So scaling is saying, like on a scale of 0 to 10, where is somebody at in their own belief about God? We're going to talk that there's good and bad that can come out of that. And it's actually really important that we talk about this, because one of the things that we're going to be discussing as a congregation and teaching a few months down the road is how do we assess what threshold people have been willing to cross in their own relationship with God. Darcy, I don't know if that you thought about that when you saw this, but we read a very good book, Darcy and I did, in preparation for some of the things we're working on as a church. And it even had a title, but I can't remember what it was. I Once Was Lost. Yeah. So scaling is the idea of, like, on a scale of 0 to 10, is somebody very, very far from God, or are they in a relationship with God? That would be like a 10. And it's not meant for us to judge them, but it's meant to kind of get an idea in our mind about, okay, this person seems receptive. This person is very standoffish. This person, man, they really are seeking God. They're under conviction. There's all these different like levels. So let's talk about the pros and the cons. I'm going to list a few on here, and then we can discuss some others as well, because I do think there are some things we should be careful about when it comes to assigning a number to people. Okay, so the first that I have is, maybe, see if this will come up. Well, it was working there we go. Yeah. So one of the pros, or one of the things in favor of putting giving someone on a scale of where they're at, is that it actually reminds us that this is a process. It doesn't even remind them, because scaling is not like you would walk up to somebody and say, you know what, I think you're a 6 in relationship to God. No, this is something that's internal, where you say, okay, does this person seem receptive to things of God? So when the author sits down on a plane and hears this woman talking all of these negative things, he might say, wow, she's very far from God. But he's also in his mind saying, but she wants to talk, right? So it helps show us a process that it's not all hot or cold. It's not either, and sometimes we as Christians have been conditioned to think this way, that people are either in love with Jesus, or they wish that, every Bible would be burned, and, that nobody would ever talk about religion. And the reality is almost everybody is somewhere in between, almost everybody. So to me, one of the benefits of coming up with at least a mental scale of talking with people who don't know the Lord is that it helps us realize that this isn't all supposed to happen overnight necessarily. I mean, it can, but it really is about the process that God is working on. That, to me, flows into a second point, which is that it helps us realize that we're not the only influence in somebody's life. In other words, if we come upon somebody and in our mind we're going, they seem about like maybe a 6, they're open. Well, that probably means that somewhere in their journey, they've had other influences that have helped bring them that far before you ever got in contact with them. Or horrifically, they may have had influences that pushed them down. They maybe used to be a 9 or a 10, and they've been hurt by the church, or they've been hurt by people who call themselves Christians, and they've been pushed further away. So on the pros, or the benefits and the negatives, it reminds us that other people are also influencing these folks. Okay. So it's not just, oh, I've got, 2 hours with this person on the plane, I better get them saved. No, maybe, as the author experienced with that woman that he was talking to, maybe you're just helping that person realize that not every Christian is out to get them. Okay. So we realize we're not the only influence. It also helps us consider the other person. That means we turn the focus away from us and really start thinking about, God, what are you doing in this person's life? Okay. Because evangelism, or outreach, whatever word you want to use, it can often become about us. We feel like we got to work through our checklist. of, okay, I want to tell them this, I want to do that, I'll make sure they hear it, and then we're going to get results. And then we're doing our job because we've got results, somebody's converted. But it's really all about the other person's relationship with God. God is not keeping a chart of how many people we have saved, because we haven't saved anybody. This is about the other person. So I think scaling can help us remember that this is really about them. But there are some potential drawbacks, but let's pause for a second. Are there any other benefits to scaling that we can maybe think of before we move on to some of the things to be cautious about? I'm just going to pull up the Facebook feed here to see if, while we're thinking. Yeah, it can help. It can help you understand, or maybe even to question. Like if someone seems sort of hesitant, you might even ask, and you say like, I go to church. And they say, oh, I would never go to church. And you log that away, but maybe you say, why not? Or has somebody heard, have you had a bad experience? Because maybe I've had a bad experience. And again, maybe that's some common ground we can discuss. So yeah, I do think it helps you understand the other person, which again it's because it's about them. It's not about me. It's not about my little checklist. Okay. Oh yeah. No, it shouldn't be that way. Yeah. Yeah, it's about redemption. Yeah. Yep. It's about redemption. It's never supposed to be about, our, the notches on our belt, that, wow, we, got another one. But sometimes it has. All right, potential cons of putting people on a scale, and at least in our own mind, is I think there's a danger of pigeonholing someone. Oh, I know where you're at. Well, maybe you do, and maybe you don't. Maybe you only know part of their story. Maybe you are feeling some things and interpreting some things that aren't the real deal. So I think we have to be careful about that, about just being like, oh, yep, you're up. There you go. I've got you figured out. Because none of us would like that, right? If somebody were to come to us and be like, oh, I know what you're like. Why? Because you've talked to me for 5 minutes? No, we have to be careful about that. I think that that's a potential con. The other one is assumptions. We can be in real danger of assuming once we've learned a little bit of somebody's story that we probably know the rest. And that's why organic conversations shouldn't be a one-time deal. Now, some of them, and Ruben, you talked about people you might just see in a store, some of them are probably going to be one-time deals. But as much as we are able to foster ongoing relationships and conversations with people, we really should keep engaging them. And instead of just feeling like, oh, I kind of know what their deal is, well, maybe you do and maybe you don't. So that can be a danger. Again, not saying that having a scale idea is necessarily a bad thing, but we got to be careful that we don't. And this is the next one that I have on here, that we aren't too rigid with it, right? As a church, we've started right before I went on sabbatical, and we're going to be picking it up again. Well, it wasn't right before; it was right before Advent. We started talking about the idea of kind of assessing our own temperature, like where am I at in my desire to reach other people with the love of Jesus. That's a self-assessment, okay? And even there, we shouldn't be too rigid because it's a little bit of a fluid thing. You really should be careful about being rigid about how you place other people. If you find yourself coming away from a conversation, and I, again, will admit that I do this sometimes, and I shouldn't, but it's human nature. If you find yourself coming away from a conversation going, that person says that they really believe in God, but I don't know. I don't think they believe as much as they say they do. We start setting ourselves up as kind of the rigid judge. I'll decide whether or not you're ready to become a Christian. It's not up to us. So we have to be careful about that kind of judgmental attitude that maybe could sneak in. Okay. Any other thoughts on the benefits or the drawbacks to the idea of scaling? He spends some time on that in this chapter, so I thought that we ought to linger on it. Yeah.
I don't think anybody's panicked
Yeah. And you mean like in relationship to where they ought to be? Yeah. Yeah. Right. And and that's the other danger sometimes is, and I hadn't even thought of that. That's a good point, is when you assign a scale, sometimes we feel like, well, if I can reach the top, then I'll be done. Right. When really we're never going to be up there. And that's again, a judgmental thing that's really dangerous, because we don't want to be walking away going, well, I got that figured out, let's move on to the next thing. We're always progressing and moving forward, and at least we should be, right? Yeah, I think that's a great point, is we got to be really careful about, and really, I would say the opposite is also true. We got to be careful with that number 0, right? I think we got to be careful with that. Now, we really, if we were going to use such a scale, maybe we would say, 0 just means someone who's not showing any interest, and a 10 might be somebody who seems like they really want to know Jesus. But you're right, on a scale of like, how close are we to God? If we ever put ourselves at the top of the scale, then we've already lost it. Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And again, that's where those measurements can be dangerous, because we don't want to ever just make it like, oh, you moved from 9 to a 10. Well, I guess you've arrived, and even in our assessment of our own temperature, like, well, how desirous am I? We try to say like, well, a 10 is when you are really, seeing this happen and you're helping other people with it too. Because if we just said a 10 means you've arrived, well, what else is there for you to do then? You've arrived. No, you haven't arrived. A 10 actually means you should be back helping other people and still pursuing yourself, because even if it was possible to get to perfection, as soon as you thought you were perfect, now you're going to start sliding back away from it because you get lazy. Yeah, absolutely. Great point. Okay, let's talk about, sorry, I'm looking at my computer screen here. Let's talk about the beauty of being open with our own brokenness. The beauty of being open with our own brokenness. The author talks about not trying to hide the fact that we've got our own issues. If a conversation is really organic, Darcy, I think you used a little while ago that it is natural. Okay. If a conversation is really natural, we don't try to bury who we really are. And that's why I say, even as a pastor, sometimes I don't talk about being a pastor, but if I'm genuine with people, I can't really hide something like that in my life. It may not be out of my mouth, but if I was just like, gave them some other profession that I am, and then they found out that I wasn't being honest about it, well, now I don't have rapport with them. So it really is about being genuine. Who are you? Okay. But if we're people, and Ruben, you just alluded to this, was saying nobody's reached the pinnacle. If we're people, and I said the one thing about conversation is it involves people, then that means that we have brokenness, fear, pain, and uncertainty in our own life. And if we pretend that it's not there so that we can put on this false front in order to get people convinced that Christianity is perfect, we will be less than genuine. And he tells the story of the woman who went in to get her nails done, I think it was, or her hair done, and had a terrible news that day from the doctor for her daughter, and how she thought she was going to go in and just suck it up and be the prim and proper Christian and really just try to carry on a conversation with this unsaved person. And 2 minutes into the conversation, she's bawling her head off because she was broken. She had gotten bad medical news about her daughter. But that was the most genuine that she had ever been with that woman. And when people say things like, well, yeah, this would be a great example probably for me. When people say to me, for example, I don't want to go to the church, I don't want to go to church because I've been hurt by the church. I can carefully share my own story. I've been hurt by the church. I've been kicked out of church. I've had membership revoked from church. I've had people that I loved and that I thought loved me turn on me. And all that was before I became a pastor. But I've experienced it. I watched my parents get hurt by the church, by Christians. Watched it happen with my in-laws. Okay. I have a police report with my name on it from a church. I've been down that road. Okay. My point is, I can actually have conversations with people who've been hurt by church because I know what that feels like. Yeah. And if I just hide that, now I don't use it just to be like, well, let me tell you my story. But if I don't relate to people and I try to hide that, I'm not being genuine. Okay. Same thing with brokenness. If I try to pretend like my life has never been torn because I'm a Christian, not only am I lying, but I'm selling a bill of goods to people that's not genuine. It's not real. Okay. Same thing with uncertainty. If I pretend like I've never had a doubt or a question, my kids come to me and talk about being afraid of dying someday. And I say, yeah, I know what that feels like. I don't really love thinking about it either. If I just pretended like, well, we all got to do it, then I don't connect with my kids. But when I'm genuine with them, then it makes a difference. So the question is, why is there beauty? There's beauty because it shows that Christ is redemptive anyway. Even amidst all of this, there's beauty because it allows us to be genuine. That it's okay to say, man, I don't know about this or that. One of the worst things that Christians can do is make up answers. I think he says that in this chapter. One of the worst things we can do is make up answers to questions when we don't know the answer. Yeah. If you say, you know what, I don't know about that. That's a good question. Let me think on that. Now, I always am a little hesitant too, because I don't want people to like ask me a question and me feel like, well, let me go back and get a really good answer for you, as if it's not organic. But if you make something up, as opposed to saying, I'm going to have to think on that, I never really thought about that, it shows that you're engaging. And there again, we're getting away from the idea of a script. If that, we're not telemarketers. If they say that they have been hurt by the church, then you say, well, those people probably weren't real Christians. That's not what we're talking about doing. Okay. Okay. Other thoughts on the idea of pain and uncertainty and fear kind of being used in our dialogues or in our conversations? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Without the Lord, I don't know if anybody gets through it, but
Yeah.
and people the people you're talking to can relate to you and realize that you are or have been vulnerable.
Yeah.
Too. So that helps to level the field where you're not this Christian, because
Right.
you're a Christian, you're like Teflon or something.
Yeah.
Real.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. It's again, organic. It's genuine. It's real. Okay. I want to wrap up our time very briefly by talking about his idea of truck-sized holes. He says at the end of the chapter, he says, there are some things in conversation that are so obvious opportunities to talk about God that you could drive a truck through them. And he says that those truck-sized holes are things like when you find yourself maybe admiring creation with somebody, when you're studying the beauty of the world. What an opportunity to talk about like that there has to be some purpose behind all of this. He says that's a truck-sized hole that you could talk about God. He lists a few others. I don't remember. I'm trying to think. I had marked them. Yeah, he calls them truck-sized openings, I guess, not truck-sized holes. When somebody says, "What did you do this weekend?" Like, how could you, like, if you went to church, it's kind of an obvious opportunity to at least say, I went to church. You don't have to say anything else about it, but it's an obvious opportunity. When you talk about your own pain, which Darcy was just mentioning that as well. When you're celebrating something and you're thanking God for a blessing, it's kind of almost weird not to talk about how God has influenced your life. So he just talks about there are some opportunities where, like, if you don't see them, I mean, it's a glaring opportunity to at least show that you have, again, I'm really opposed to the idea of we've got to look for little holes where we can sneak Jesus into the conversation. I don't like that because it's manipulative. If Jesus is part of your life and you are having genuine conversations with people, then he's going to come up in conversation. Because we talk about our kids, we talk about our jobs, we talk about our favorite sports teams, we talk about the things we do socially, we talk about the foods that we eat, we talk about the vacations that we take. If Jesus is an important part of our life, he really should come up. Even if it's not coming up. Now, I will use an example. If you meet somebody in your neighborhood for the first time and you find out that just like you, they enjoy hiking. Unlike you, they do not enjoy watching football. Then when you talk with them, you're probably not frequently going to talk about football because you know it's not something they're into. But hiking, you have a lot in common. You might talk about it. Jesus is not the same as football, okay? But if you know somebody is not high on a threshold of interest in religious things, you probably aren't going to bring it up quite as frequently. It'll be a little more delicate. And again, that's where scaling can be helpful to help us get an idea of where people might be. But it's still going to come up. Again, what do you have planned for the weekend? And their answer might be, well, I've got this, then this, and I'm going to try to sleep in a little bit and so forth. What are you doing? Yeah, I got a busy day here, there, and I'll be in church on Sunday. And then or I'm in this ministry thing and our church is getting together to go help people, or we're working at a food pantry or whatever. They're just opportunities. And to ignore them on purpose makes you less than genuine, makes you less than organic. Okay. Any final thoughts? I really want to try to keep this about 45 minutes. We're just about there. So any final thoughts on this? We are going to try to get through 12 and 13 next week. It's going to be much more of just dipping our toes in the water because it's stuff we'll come back to as a church later on. But it's important to talk about as we finish up the book, and then we'll be done. And we're actually going to post Easter. We're hoping to move forward with some more resources and discussions. Remember, we're talking about transformation, God changing us so that he can reach others through us. And that's really what we're all about. So thank everyone for joining us online, here in person. We will do it again next Wednesday. Hope to see folks live or in person or streaming live on Sunday morning at 10:30, and then for Bible study on Sunday night. May the Lord bless you. Have a wonderful rest of your week.